view and that amazing cake over there, so I won't take up too much of your time, but I wanted to talk today about what it means to be an American in meritocracy. I know I'm preaching to the choir to this crowd to say that this is an amazing country, and I don't have to repeat that, but it's worth repeating during the holiday season, and especially in light of what happened on November 5th and the incredible opportunity we have before us to really return this country to its founding principles. You know, I'm a child of legal immigrants. My parents came to this country legally, and they did so just like many others before them because America is, as President Reagan said, a shining city on a hill with the last best hope of mankind. And the reason for that is not just because we have a vibrant economy or a prodigious military. Other countries have those in shades as well. What makes this country truly exceptional beyond its people are the values upon which we were founded. A belief in natural rights, due process of law, equal protection, freedom of speech, self-defense, the impartial application of justice. It's those values that make us strong. And yet so many in our society, they seem to have lost touch with those founding principles and ideals, and instead have given into a culture of grievance and of victimhood. Over the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen a noticeable polling movement away from organized religion. But it would be a profound mistake to suggest that people somehow no longer hold true to deeply held beliefs. They've just replaced them with secular progressive methodologies. Ideologies like critical race theory, climate alarmism, BLM, radical gender ideology. These dogmas that are seemingly irrefutable. It's how they can claim nonsensically, for example, at the end of each decade, that the earth is going to warm into oblivion. And then when it inevitably doesn't happen, they just wipe their hands, rinse, and repeat. And they keep repeating it as if nothing has changed their proposition. It's because these theologies, while they appear to be religious in nature, they lack what's at the core foundation of every meaningful religion, the belief in redemption and the possibility of salvation. Instead, what they really are is they're nothing more than thinly veiled political ideologies that only seek to divide us on the basis of our external characteristics rather than based on appeal to our founding ideals and our commonality. It's because it's in a raw pursuit of political power. And the only way to overcome these secular false idols is based on a national revival in the spirit of 1776 to use this election to return this country to our founding ideals. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Diversity is not our strength. Diversity is a description, it's an adjective. What makes this country strong is that out of our collective diversity, we are united in a common set of ideals and principles, a belief in God, in family, in country, in that order, in an unapologetic pursuit of a culture of excellence, of meritocracy, where we are judged not based on the color of our skin, but rather by the content of our character. That's the fundamental challenge of our country, the opportunity that we have to reclaim on January 20th, and the mission for our generation and for our country. Yeah. It is absolutely true that this country's original sin was slavery. But it is also true that we fought a war to end it. We ensconced constitutional prohibitions against it, and we passed sweeping civil rights legislation decades ago to bring about a more equal and just society. That is in no way to suggest that society is perfect. Of course not. We will always have warts that have to be ironed out, and we all have our collective duty to do so. But it is to say that endlessly focusing on individual instances of transgressions, real or supposed, only serves to divide when it's not placed in the context of the enormous amount of progress that this country has made. And the most clear and succinct example of that is the devaluation of the value of merit at the expense of diversity, the replacement of the individual at the expense of the collective, the replacement of the idea of equality, meaning equality of opportunity with equity, the equality of outcome. Critical race theory is the idea that if there's any societal institution which in any way has a racially disparate outcome that is not exactly proportionate to the population as a whole, it means even if there was no discriminatory intent involved in the creation, that the system and its beneficiaries are complicit in racism somehow. It's outgrowth of DEI, which its proponents call diversity, equity, and inclusion, but which more accurately should be termed division, exclusion, and intolerance. It posits a simplistic worldview that would divide society into a simple binary. You're either an oppressor or you're an oppressed, and there's nothing in between. It's how they can call seemingly neutral institutions like standardized tests, the scientific method, freedom of speech, even something as trivial as showing up on time, as somehow vestiges of white supremacy. That's real. Look at it. The African American Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian actually said on a plaque that was a vestige of white supremacy. At the same time that they refused an exhibit for Justice Thomas because they disagree with his political views. It's how they can label numerical minorities in the population who get ahead on their own hard work, success, and effort as somehow oppressors themselves. Asian Americans, for the great sin of valuing nuclear families, a strong emphasis on education, and doing well on standardized tests, get labeled as somehow pejoratively white adjacent. How Jews, who have achieved outsized levels of prominence in notable fields like law and entertainment, get labeled as oppressors, thereby justifying violence against them across the globe. It's how they can label people who are underrepresented as somehow perpetual victims, incapable of assisting themselves. What a terrible thought to place in someone's mind that they have no agency over their own ideals and ability to move forward. And yet the most harmful aspect of this equity-based agenda is what it calls for as a solution. Because in the name of reaching equal outcomes, it requires discriminating on the basis of race. We've had a number of school districts across the country, including right here in North Texas, Frisco, and Southlake in recent years. They had their students conduct something called a privilege walk. That's when they line all the students up, and they tell them that if you're white or you're male, you get to take a step forward. If you're female, you're black, Hispanic, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, you take a step backward. Imagine the level of self-loathing that must create in the minds of those students who are forced to look across their classroom. I can see you shaking your head. It's unbelievable to believe that this is happening. That you look across your classroom, you see friends from kindergarten, 3rd, 4th grade, now somehow judged as superior or inferior to you on the basis of something that is totally out of your control. This is 180 degrees away from the vision of Dr. King, and even of radicals like Malcolm X. And yet this equity-based cancer, it's infected nearly every aspect of American life, from classrooms to corporate boardrooms. And that's because in society, rather than extolling the principles of hard work, virtue, merit, we've too often replaced it with the idea of diversity. But by diversity, they don't mean what the people around this table and other rational folks believe, which would be people of different backgrounds, like what we have here today, coming together for a common purpose. No, what they mean is visual diversity only. It's how you can end up with 90% of the Ivy League faculty lounges being registrants of one political party. How you can have 90% of Silicon Valley tech donations. Even in this cycle, we all see all the tech bros coming out in favor of a Make America Great movement. Doesn't matter. 90% of Silicon Valley tech donations this cycle went to one political party. It's not by accident that Google's large language model in its first iteration was incapable of accurately depicting a white historical figure. It couldn't generate a conservative argument on any policy position. It's the same reason why the leaders of our esteemed educational institutions can't condemn homicidal maniacs in the Middle East, but they would gladly kick your kids and grandkids out of school for simply stating basic biological facts. It's because this is a low bigotry of expectations at the expense of excellence. And nowhere has this been seen more clearly than in the policy of affirmative action, which for decades allowed institutions of higher learning to actively discriminate in their applicant pool based on the race or gender of their applicants. And of course, this was recently the challenge of a Supreme Court case, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC. And you all know the results of that case. I don't need to belabor the point, but it is worth highlighting some of the salient facts from that trial. During the case, Harvard admitted that it used race as a, quote, determinative tipping point. They gave Asian American applicants stereotypically lower subjective personality scores in order to counterbalance significantly higher GPAs and standardized test scores. On some cases, nearly 400 points out of a 1,600-point test, higher than for other races. At the end, the rebalancing effort was so successful that if you're an Asian American applicant in the top 10% academically, your chance of getting admitted was equal to that of a black student in the bottom 40%. Thankfully, the Supreme Court ruled that the use of race in higher education was unconstitutional. But we know for a fact, they don't need to tell us, that the proponents of DEI and ESG and its outgrowth will continue to fight tooth and nail, especially after this last election, because they understand that it's not just for their own virtue signaling, they believe it benefits them politically. It's why in the aftermath of the decision, you saw a number of colleges simply rush to change their essay prompts to ask applicants to volunteer their demographic information. Why we saw some colleges like Columbia that were so brazen that they actually changed their essays into videos in order to just look at the applicant before they were forced to retract in the face of public pressure. We've seen school districts across the country change their curriculum in order to cater to the lowest common denominator. We've seen schools in California and others adopt something called equity-based math. I have no clue what that means. But what it's meant in practice is that a number of high schools don't teach calculus. A number of middle schools don't teach algebra. Why? Because too few preferred minorities are qualifying for the class. So rather than challenging the most talented and gifted students among us, regardless of background, regardless of color, we are enforcing a culture of mediocrity. We've seen this in a movement away from objective metrics of success. Even before the decision, Stanford and other elite universities started to move to make the SAT and ACT optional as part of the application process. That's despite the fact that we know by all available data that not only are standardized tests the best predictor of postgraduate success, they are the great equalizer for poor yet excellent students who lack the resources to take 100 extracurricular activities and specialized coaching. It puts them on an even playing field. And it's perhaps for that reason that a number of schools have actually re-implemented this testing requirement. Because today, higher education, its only useful purpose is as a credentialing mechanism. So they need to be graduating people who are at least semi-competent in what they claim to be. We've seen it pollute the medical field. If you or your family members or your children are going through the process, you'll know that to become a licensed physician in the U.S., you first have to pass the 3-part U.S. medical licensing exam. Step 1 has traditionally been viewed as the hardest because it tests the broadest level of subject matter, and because tests on that competitive scores on that competitive test are used to determine your placement in competitive residencies and specialties across the country. For years, for decades, that test was based on a graded score. Since 2022, that test is now pass-fail. The National Institutes of Health and a number of medical schools across the country now require DEI statements as a condition of your grant or your admissions application. The result is that anyone in this room or anyone outside this room, you go to see a doctor, especially a newly minted one for care, your likelihood of getting substandard care from a doctor who may or may not be qualified is significantly higher than what it should be. And we've seen this pollute corporate boardrooms. We've got fund managers like BlackRock and others prioritizing ESG and other virtue signaling goals rather than maximizing shareholder value, which is their fiduciary obligation. The result is that in the long term, our 401ks and pensions will be lower than what they need to be. And we've seen a number of Fortune 500 companies just openly adopt express race and gender quotas. The CEO of United Airlines has said that by the end of this decade, he wants over 50% of his pilots to be female and, quote, people of color. I hate that term. You know, you look back at black and white photos from the Jim Crow era, you've got minorities who are forced to drink from the colored person fountain. But liberals think that if they just swap the word order, that somehow this makes them above and beyond reproach. But be that as it may, that number today is 26%. I hope he gets there. I really hope that people follow their passion to be whatever they want in life. But that means over the next 5 years, they have to double that number, which is mathematically impossible based on matriculation rates, unless you reduce standards. But I know I can speak pretty confidently for myself and probably for everyone at this table, that no one cares what the race or gender is of their pilot. We just want to know that, God forbid, in the instance of an emergency, having to make an emergency landing in the Hudson or your door flying off, that the person in the cockpit can land the plane safely, that they're competent to do the job. And that's why we have to push back against this cancerous ideology even harder after this election, because not only does it serve to divide us, and it serves against our cause of national unity, but because when it's faced with an ounce of scrutiny, it crumbles under the weight of its own falsehood. Take, for example, the issue of criminal justice reform, in which I'm broadly supported. In 2017, Professor Roland Fryer, the youngest tenured professor in the history of the Harvard Economics Department, who happens to be black, he published a seminal study in which he found that while there is some evidence to suggest that cops are more likely to use non-lethal force against black suspects than against others, there is zero evidence to support the proposition that cops are more likely to use lethal force against black suspects than against others. I want to pause and make sure everybody thinks about that for a moment, because that is exactly opposite the media and left-wing political narrative that we have been fed over the last decade and a half that has suggested that it is somehow open season by cops on minorities. Nothing could be further from the truth. That, of course, in no way am I suggesting that every single cop and suspect interaction is above board. Of course not. There are millions of interactions every year, and allegations of mistreatment and abuse deserve to be investigated, prosecuted, and punished where appropriate. And we all have seen in this room, and thankfully a majority of the country was able to finally clearly see what has happened over the last 4 to 8 years when you have a politicized Justice Department that places its thumb on the scale of persecution and prosecution rather than on seeking justice, and the damage it can cause to the social fabric of a country. And so we should all be cognizant of the due process rights of our fellow citizens. But the fact remains that orders of magnitude more cops are killed each year than the total number of unarmed white and black suspects combined. And yet for the great sin of simply publishing the data, Dr. Fryer was placed on administrative leave for 2 years on the basis of totally unrelated specious allegations. Meanwhile, the former president of his university that made that decision, he was unable to condemn Hamas before a congressional hearing. This is the type of ideological rot that exists at the highest level of our society, our culture, our education, and in our government. It's not just the systematic attempt to devalue merit in society writ large. It's also the attempt to devalue the role of parents and of families in the upbringing of our children. When we send our kids to school, we have a basic expectation that they learn how to do reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the proper contextual history of this country. Instead, too often it seems that they're being fed anti-American tropes and radical gender ideology. The idea that somehow your sex is fluid, that it can change over time. Of course, the biological fact is that there are only 2 genders, and yes, there are rare genetic abnormalities, but the exception does not create the rule. Just like it is a biological fact that life begins at conception. It is Orwellian to suggest that somehow sex is assigned at birth. It is established at conception. It is recognized at birth, even before that. Gender dysphoria is a real, diagnosable medical condition. It deserves to be treated with compassion and with dignity for those who are afflicted. But let's be clear, affirming a delusion and making public policy on that basis, that is not compassion, that is cruelty. America, we are the most tolerant country on the face of God's green earth. But that tolerance is a two-way street, and it has to be reciprocated, and it ends at the truth. And yet we see too many administrators and teachers across the country seemingly believe that they are in the best position of raising our kids, rather than parents. We've seen a proliferation of laws across the country, Minnesota, New Jersey, California, and others, where teachers are prohibited by law from telling their parents of kids if their kids ask to go by a different gender or name in school. We've seen a proliferation of obscene materials in schools and public libraries. Even today, there are dozens of titles in DISD and other local libraries that you wouldn't dare to read to your mother or your grandmother, but which are readily accessible to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids without any supervision. We have to push back against the left's attempt to recharacterize parental involvement as somehow tantamount to book burning. What crap! The Supreme Court over 40 years ago held that parents and administrators, while they can't remove books based on political viewpoint, of course not, they can remove books unmitigated if they are obscene or age inappropriate. No one is banning anything. You're free to go across the street, go on your phone, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and buy whatever you want. We're just asking that if you want to read your own crap, that you do it on your own time and not to our kids. There was a time in this country's history when legalized discrimination was the law. Not just slavery, the imprisonment of innocent Japanese Americans during World War II for no fault of their own, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Tuskegee experiment, and so on and so forth. And every single one of those sins must be taught to our kids so we don't repeat the errors of our past in the future. But they must also, just as importantly, be taught in the context of the enormous amount of progress that this country has made. And that's important, because to the extent that societal inequities still exist today, there are often entirely legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons for why that might be the case. Prior to passage of LBJ's ruinous Great Society welfare programs, of which we are still paying the costs and consequences today, the black marital rate was higher than what it is today. In the 20 years prior to passage of those same piece of legislation, the black middle class grew at a faster rate than what it did in the subsequent 20 years. And that's after passage of the Civil Rights Act. And today you can draw a near direct linear relationship between the breakdown of the nuclear family, the lack of fathers in the home, versus the level of wealth accumulation and educational accomplishment. A relationship that holds across ethnicities, across races, and across age groups. The great sin of left-wing and liberal ideologies is not just that they are deeply harmful to the very people who they're supposed to help, but that they prevent us as a society from discussing, from diagnosing, from solving the issues that are at the root cause of so many of our societal dysfunction. Namely, the breakdown of our nuclear family and the failure of a K-12 education system that too often prioritizes victimhood at the expense of merit. The success sequence exists for a reason. If you graduate high school, you get a job, you get married, and you have children, and you do it in that order. The order is important. Your likelihood of ending up in poverty declined by over 80%. That's not to suggest that people can't be wildly successful coming from other backgrounds. Of course they can. I can speak personally. I have many friends who have succeeded, notwithstanding whatever their family circumstances have been in their own spheres of life. But it is simply to state something that we intuitively know to be true, that has the benefit of being backed by empirical data, which is that there are some family formations that are more conducive to being successful than others. And yet it's verboten to state the truth, and that has to stop. Today in society, too many people, we talk past one another. We've lost the ability to disagree without being disagreeable ourselves. And that's because too often in public and increasingly, unfortunately, in private life, our founding ideals have been pushed aside in favor of useless political dialogue, mindless TikTok memes, and divisive rhetoric that only serves to rip us apart. But the days of being called every ist and full word in the dictionary and being afraid about it, those days have to be done. We have to have the courage to speak the truth and do so unapologetically. Our Declaration of Independence posits that we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them the rights to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You are entitled to the pursuit of happiness. You are not entitled to the result. Our Constitution protects, in the equal protection clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendments, all of us to be treated equally, regardless of our background. It prohibits the exact type of discriminatory policies we see championed in so many aspects of our society. In our collective faiths, they all teach us to treat one another as we would wish to be treated ourselves, to be our brother's keeper. And it all points in a singular direction of unapologetically pursuing a culture of excellence, of meritocracy, of a colorblind meritocracy. That begins by reestablishing self-governance in our homes, our schools, our state, and across the country. And it means ensuring that our K-12 education system is in the business of actually educating, not indoctrinating our students. And I'll conclude with this. I guess it's important. We have a tremendous opportunity ahead of us with this election result, an opportunity to change the course of this country back to its founding roots. This country was not founded by weak men and women. We stand on the shoulders of giants, people who came before us like George Washington, John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Dr. King. People who, despite their personal flaws, sacrificed so that we can have the country we have today. And we all get to say we, because America is singularly unique in that no matter when you came to this country, so long as you did it the right way, so long as you assimilate and buy into our values, you are treated as a full-fledged equal to those who have been here for bloodlines and generations before you. Let me assure you that there is no other country on God's green earth that treats you with that level of respect and dignity. Our ancestors, they fought on the fields of Lexington and Concord to preserve freedom. They died on the fields of Gettysburg to preserve our union, and they marched on the bridges of Selma all the way through present to ensure a more equal and just society for everyone. The story of our country is still being written. It's contained dark chapters, there's absolutely no doubt about that, but it is also the story of perpetual progress towards a more perfect union. We are not a nation of victims, nor should we act like it. Our children, we have an obligation to ensure that they understand our founding ideals, even if they don't fully appreciate them at the time. And we have an obligation to ensure that they receive the same blessings of liberty that we've been so fortunate to live and breathe ourselves. That's a challenge to ensure a better world for our kids and a better future for our nation. Let's work hard to keep this country great. I appreciate your time. Thank you.